Hello everyone. Today I'm going to explain the anatomy and structure of spinal cord. Spinal cord is a part of the central nervous system and it is responsible for a variety of reflexes that occur in our body. Let's learn in detail about its structure and anatomy. So firstly, what is spinal cord? Spinal cord is the part of the central nervous system that extends from the brain. Here is an image of the external view of spinal cord. So it starts from the inferior part of the brain and it extends till the superior lumbar vertebrae. And all the spinal nerves extend further to the lower abdomen region. So the reflexes, an example of the reflexes that occurs in the body with the help of spinal cord is, for example, if we are touching a hot object, the sensory neurons receive the impulse and they send it to the brain and spinal cord that our body has touched something hot and it is going to harm us. The sensory impulse is processed and then a signal is given from the spinal cord and brain to remove the hand, and this reflex is known as the motor. It is a motor reflex. So spinal cord plays a pivotal role in the reflexes of our body. Let's learn about the protective structures. The spinal cord needs to be protected since it is a sensitive organ and it involves a variety of structures that is crucial for the body. The first is the vertebral column. That is, it is located between a vertebrae, which looks something like this. All these vertebrae fuse together to form or lay on top of each other like a stack to form a vertebral column, and the spinal cord lies in between of this vertebral column. These vertebrae are bones and they provide a hard structure to protect the spinal cord. Apart from the vertebrae, we have vertebral ligaments, meninges, and cerebrospinal fluid that provides additional protection. Firstly, what are the meninges? So there are three coverings that comes under the meninges, which are named the dura mater, arachnoid matter, and the pia mater. They cover and protect both the spinal cord and the brain. These meninges are found in the brain, and the meninges of the brain are known as cranial meninges. The ligaments that I mentioned earlier, these are triangular shaped membranous extensions of the pia mater, which is the innermost membrane which suspends the spinal cord. These extensions are called denticulate ligaments and they protect the spinal cord against sudden displacement that could result in shock. So let's learn about the three protective meninges that I mentioned earlier. Meninges are broadly divided into three, from superficial to the innermost. The first is dura mater, the second is arachnoid, and the third is pia mater. The dura mater is the outermost, and it is a thick membrane that protects the spinal cord from any shock, and it is composed of dense connective tissue. The arachnoid is the middle membrane or the middle covering, and it consists of thin, avascular, and loosely arranged fibers. The innermost membrane is the pia mater. It is transparent, and the pia mater consists squamous to cuboidal cells which are interlaced in between bundles of collagen fibers and few elastic fibers. So these are the three meninges or the three protective coverings that are seen in the spinal cord. The outermost being the dura mater, the middle being the arachnoid mater, and the innermost is the pia mater. The dura mater is the thickest, the arachnoid is thin, and the pia mater is almost transparent. This is an image which shows the spinal cord. The innermost membrane is the pia mater. This is the middle one, which is arachnoid matter, and the outermost is thick, the dura mater. And there are spaces in between each matter. The outermost space is known as the epidural space. The space between arachnoid and pia mater is known as the subdural space. And the innermost, that is the space between the pia mater and the spinal cord, is known as subarachnoid space. Cerebrospinal fluid is filled in the subarachnoid space, and in cases of disorders or in cases of diagnostic tests where we need to diagnose certain conditions, and if we require cerebrospinal fluid, it is taken from the subarachnoid space as it is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Now, this was the superficial idea of what exactly is a spinal cord and how is it protected. Let's learn in detail about the anatomy. So firstly, let's learn about external anatomy. That is, if we view the spinal cord externally, अगर हम बाहर से spinal cord को देखते हैं तो वो किस तरीके से दिखेगा? So externally, first of all, the spinal cord is a oval and slightly flattened organ, and it extends from the medulla oblongata in adults till the superior lumbar vertebrae, the L2 vertebrae. There are multiple lumbar vertebrae. And in infants, it extends till L3 to L4. This was in adults. The length of the spinal cord is approximately 42 to 45 centimeter. And when viewed externally, there are two enlargements seen. In this image, we can see that there are two enlargements. This is slightly thickened than the other areas. These are the two enlargements. The first enlargement is cervical enlargement, since it is around the cervical vertebrae. And the second enlargement is known as the lumbar enlargement, which is near the lumbar vertebrae. The enlargements can be divided as superior enlargement and inferior enlargement. The superior enlargement was the cervical enlargement, since it was on the upper portion, and the inferior is the lumbar enlargement. The superior enlargement starts from C4 and ends till T1. The inferior enlargement or the lumbar enlargement starts from T9 and ends till T12. In the superior or cervical enlargement, the nerves to upper limb arise from cervical enlargement. There are multiple spinal nerves that start from the spinal cord and it reaches to different body parts. So the nerves of the upper limbs arise from the cervical enlargement, and the nerves to lower limb arise from the lumbar enlargement. So inferior to the lumbar enlargement, we have a cone-like structure, which is known as conus medullaris. For example, this is the cervical and then this is the lumbar enlargement. So we have a cone-like structure here, which is known as conus medullaris. And after the conus medullaris, we have a small filament-like structure, which is known as phylum terminale. This is the terminal ending of the spinal cord, and the nerves usually arise laterally or parallelly from the spinal cord. But as we reach the end, the spinal nerves start to fall like hair. It has an angle inferiorly, and this bundle of nerves is known as the cauda equina. And it looks like the tail of the horse, hence it is named as the cauda equina. So this image again shows it extends from the medulla oblongata. Here, spinal cord is mentioned. So it extends from the medulla oblongata, the inferior part of the brain, to the superior border of the second lumbar vertebrae. So it ends somewhat here, the phylum terminal, and it starts from the inferior part of brain, from the medulla oblongata. And when it is viewed externally, we can see two enlargements. As I have mentioned earlier, the cervical enlargement or the superior enlargement and the inferior enlargement, also known as lumbar enlargement. And nerves to and from the lower limbs arise from the lumbar enlargement, and nerves from the upper limbs arise from cervical enlargement. This was the external anatomy. That is, if we view it externally, we would be able to notice all the spinal nerves and the enlargements. So what if we make a transverse section of the spinal cord? So the internal anatomy states what kind of structures we can see when a transverse section of spinal cord is taken. So firstly, as we all know that the brain and spinal cord both contains a white matter and a gray matter. So when we take a transverse section of the spinal cord, we can notice the gray matter and the white matter. And there are certain fissures or divisions that is seen in the spinal cord. This is a wide groove or it is a major fissure, also known as anterior median fissure. It is a wide groove on the anterior or ventral side. So if we explain what anterior and posterior is, this is the back area and this is the chest area or the front area. So when we view from the anterior side, we notice a wide groove or a wide fissure, also known as the anterior median fissure. And on the posterior side, we notice a narrow furrow on the posterior side, which is known as the posterior median sulcus. The anterior fissure is known as the anterior median fissure, and on the posterior side, we have a narrow furrow, which is known as the posterior median sulcus. Now, let's learn about the gray and white matter. The gray matter is usually shaped like an H, or it is shaped in the butterfly form, as we can see here. And the white matter is surrounding the gray matter in the spinal cord. In the brain, it is the opposite. The white matter is the inner part and the gray matter is the outer part. And in the spinal cords, the gray matter is the inner part and the white matter is the outer part. Now, in the gray matter, there are certain divisions of gray matter, and these divisions are known as the horns. They are subdivided into regions, and these regions are known as horns. And in the gray matter horns, we have three types: the posterior gray horn, the lateral gray horn, and the anterior gray horn. So the anterior gray horn, when we view from the frontal or the chest side, uh, the first gray horn that is seen is the anterior one, the middle one is the lateral, and from the back, we can see the posterior gray horn. And these are the functions or this type of stimuli that these gray horns consist. The posterior gray horns usually carry the somatic sensory, and the lateral gray horns usually carry the visceral sensory and visceral motor. That is, the lateral gray horn controls the smooth muscles or the involuntary actions that occurs in our body. And the anterior gray horn usually has somatic motor functions. So the somatic sensory involves that, for example, if I'm touching a hot substance, the somatic sensory would be activated from the posterior gray horn, and then it will go to the brain, and then an impulse or a signal is received in the spinal nerve. And if an autonomic action is required, then the visceral sensory and visceral motor are activated. And if the skeletal muscle needs to be activated, that is, if I want to remove my hand from the hot object, then the somatic motor is activated in the anterior gray horn. So this was a little detail about the gray matter. Now, because of the gray matter, the white matter is also divided into few regions. As we can see here from this sulcus, this is one of the white region, which is known as the posterior white column. And this is the second region, which is known as the lateral white column. And this is the third region, which is known as the anterior white column. So it is mentioned here, the white matter of the spinal cord is also organized into regions, and it is broadly divided into areas known as the anterior white column, the posterior white column, and the lateral white column. So let's learn about the process of sensory or motor output. So how does the reflex work, or how is the input and output taken? So this is an image that explains the process. So firstly, we have sensory receptors on the skin. This is the first step where, for example, if I'm touching a hot object, the sensory receptors of my skin gets activated. Then it is carried on as nerve impulses along axons into the spinal nerve. That is the second process. The nerve impulses are carried into the spinal nerve. Then axons of sensory neurons enters the white matter. As we can see here in the third process, it enters the white matter of the spinal cord, and then it ascends to the brain. Hence, it is known as the ascending tract. So what is a tract? If a nerve is covering a long distance, it is known as a tract. So as we can see that this nerve or this neuron is covering the receptors from the skin and it is going on till the brain. So it is known as a tract. And since it is going from the organ to the brain, it is an ascending tract. So first the receptors were activated, the nerve impulses are carried till the white matter, and from the white matter, the impulse is carried to the brain through the sensory ascending tract. Then axons of sensory neurons also enter the posterior gray horn. As we can see in the fourth process, this is the posterior gray horn. It enters the posterior gray horn and there is a synapse with the interneuron. And then it extends to white matter and it again ascends to the brain. Here, as we can see from the fourth process, there is an interneuron synapse and it is again ascended to the brain. Then axons of sensory neurons also form a synapse with interneurons, and it also forms synapse with the somatic neuron. As we can see here, this is the first synapse with the interneuron. In the fifth process, the sensory neurons form synapse with the interneuron, and then it further forms a synapse with the somatic motor neuron. This is the second synapse that is formed, and here we can see the motor neuron, and this is a descending tract. The sixth process is as the impulse is generated and it is ascended to the brain then gives an order to the body. So that impulse is transported via the descending tract, that is, this is coming from the brain to the spinal cord via the axons of motor tracts and it enters the white matter. This is the white matter as we can see. In the seventh process, somatic motor neurons form synapses where and the anterior gray horn, this is the anterior gray horn, and this is the synapse between the interneuron and the skeletal muscle. So from here, because of the sensory impulse that we received through the interneuron synapse, the order is given to the skeletal muscle and this is a somatic motor response. Then in the eighth process, we have a motor output from spinal cord and that motor output is received in the ninth step, which is to the autonomic motor neuron, and this further acts on the cardiac muscles, the smooth muscles, and glands. So sometimes the cardiac muscle is stimulated or it is depressed, and the smooth muscle might be either contracted or relaxed, and the glands might secrete more. This was the process of sensory or motor output. The sensory input is received through the sensory receptors, the impulses are carried, and it enters the white matter, and then it is taken to the brain via the sensory ascending tract. And the sensory receptors are also entered into the gray matter, which is the posterior gray horn. And from there, it forms a synapse with the interneuron, and then it is again ascended to the brain to receive an output from the brain. And the sensory input that is received from the receptors might also form a synapse with the interneurons. And then either an order could be given to the skeletal muscle according to the situation, or an order could be given to the autonomic motor neuron and further carried to the cardiac muscles, smooth muscles, and glands. So these are autonomic muscles, and this was somatic muscle. So this is how the spinal cord receives sensory or motor input and output. And these are different segments of the spinal cord. The first is a cervical segment. It has a relatively large diameter and more amount of white matter as compared to the gray matter. And this is the thoracic part, which also has a relatively higher amount of white matter as compared to the gray matter, but it has a small diameter. This is the lumbar section, and it is almost circular, and it has very large anterior and posterior gray horns, and a small lateral gray horn. This is the sacral region. It is relatively small in size, but it has large amounts of gray matter as compared to the white matter. And there is a coccygeal region, which resembles lower sacral spinal segments, but much smaller. Now, this was the anatomy and external and internal view of the spinal cord. To receive an input or to give an output, we also need the spinal nerves. So let's learn in detail about what exactly are spinal nerves. The spinal nerves connect the CNS or central nervous system to sensory receptors, muscles, and glands in all parts of the body. They are paths of communication between the spinal cord and specific regions of the body. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves which are named and numbered according to the region. So if it is present in the cervical region, it is known as the cervical spinal nerves, and thoracic spinal nerves, lumbar spinal nerves, and sacral spinal nerves. Accordingly, there are 31 pairs. The first cervical pair of spinal nerve emerges from the spinal cord between the occipital bone and the atlas. The atlas is the first cervical vertebrae. So the first cervical pair of spinal nerves emerge from the first cervical vertebrae. Most of the remaining spinal nerves emerge from the spinal cord through the intervertebral foramina. Foramina means any opening. So intervertebral foramina refers to the opening between two vertebrae. This is the intervertebral foramina. From here, the spinal nerves emerge towards other parts of the body. Spinal nerves C1 to C7 exit the vertebral canal above their corresponding vertebrae, and spinal nerves T1 to L5 exit the vertebral canal below their corresponding vertebrae. So some spinal nerves exit from the above, and some spinal nerves exist from the below. The C1 and C7 spinal nerves exist from the above of the foramina, and the T1 to L5 spinal nerves exist from below the foramina. This is a more elaborate picture of the spinal nerves. These are the cervical nerves. These are the thoracic nerves. We have 12 pairs of thoracic nerves. We have 8 pairs of cervical nerves. And we have 5 pairs of lumbar nerves. And then we have 5 pairs of sacral nerves. And we have 1 pair of coccygeal nerve. And then it ends with the filum terminal or the terminal filament. So there are coverings for the spinal nerve also to protect it. Mainly there are 3 connective tissue coverings. The first is endoneurium, perineurium, and epineurium. The endoneurium covers the single axon. So the covering that covers a single axon is known as the endoneurium. As we can see in this image, this is a single axon, and the covering of this single axon is known as the endoneurium. Then we have the perineurium. There are bundles of axons, also known as the fascicles. These are the bundle of multiple axons, and this whole bundle would be termed as a fascicle. And the covering that covers each fascicle is known as the perineurium. The covering of fascicles is termed as the perineurium. Then we have the epineurium, which further covers the multiple fascicles. The fascicles further bundle together to form a single spinal nerve, and the epineurium is the outermost covering of the spinal nerve. These were the connective tissue coverings that cover the spinal nerve, its fascicles, and each axon. Now, distribution of spinal nerves. So, how exactly are the spinal nerves distributed? So, to distribute them, there are branches, plexuses, and there are intercostal nerves. Branches, it is from a short distance after passing through the intervertebral foramen or the intervertebral opening. The spinal nerve divides into several branches. So if these are the vertebrae and this is the intervertebral opening and these are the spinal nerves, after covering a short distance, these start to branch. So these branches helps in the distribution of spinal nerves. The second is plexus. So axons from the anterior rami of spinal nerves, except for the thoracic nerves T2 to T12, do not go directly to the body structures they supply. So not all nerves directly exit the intervertebral foramen and connect to the organ. It might sometimes form networks on both the left and right sides of the body by joining with various number of axons from the anterior rami of adjacent nerves. Such a network of axon is called as the plexus. So all the nerves do not directly connect to the different body organs, and they do not directly give an input or output. So we can see sometimes it forms various bundles together on the left and right, both the sides of the body by joining with various number of axons. Rami also refers to branches. So from the anterior rami, that is from the front, the branches and bundles that are formed uh, join together to form networks, and such a network is known as a plexus. There are multiple plexus. There is cervical plexus, there is brachial plexus, lumbar plexus, and a coccygeal plexus, coccygeal and sacral plexus. So there are multiple networks that are formed from the cervical nerves or from the thoracic nerves, from the lumbar nerves, and these nerves form networks together, which is termed as a plexus. And these plexuses do not contain the nerves from T2 to T12. So these nerves form the intercostal nerves. The anterior rami of spinal nerves T2 to T12 do not enter into the formation of plexuses and are known as intercostal nerves or thoracic nerves. And these nerves directly connect to the structures they supply in the intercostal spaces, which involves the skin of axilla or the ribs. As we know, there are intercostal muscles present in the ribs, and these muscles are supplied by the intercostal nerves, which arise from mainly T3 to T6. And the skin of anterior and lateral chest wall is also supplied by the intercostal nerves. So this is how the spinal nerves are distributed by branches, by plexuses, and by the intercostal nerves. The next is a dermatome. So each spinal nerve contains sensory neurons that serve a specific predictable segment of the body. So on the skin, there are various segments which is supplied by different spinal nerves. And one of the cranial nerves, the trigeminal nerve, which is the fifth nerve, serves most of the skin of the face and scalp. This is an image that shows the various dermatomes. So the sections or segments of skin that is supplied by a particular cranial or a particular spinal nerve is termed as the dermatome. These are the sections. Each section represents a dermatome. So there is also a presence of the cranial nerve known as the trigeminal nerve, the fifth cranial nerve, which supplies the scalp and face, the skin of the scalp and face, as we can see here. And these are the various sections that is provided by the spinal nerves. The area of the skin that provides sensory input to the CNS via one pair of spinal nerve or trigeminal nerve is called a dermatome. So either the sensory input is the trigeminal nerve, or if it is taken by the spinal nerve through the skin, those segments of the skin are known as a dermatome. And dermatomes are especially important because when we know the different spinal cord segments or the dermatomes, then it is possible to locate damaged regions of the spinal cord. For example, if a person has an injury of the spinal cord, अगर किसी को कोई ट्रॉमा की वजह से या कोई एक्सीडेंट की वजह से अगर चोट लग जाती है स्पाइनल कॉर्ड में, तो बॉडी का कौन सा पार्ट उसकी वजह से इफेक्ट होने वाला है वो हमें डर्मेटोम से पता चलता है. सो एग्जांपल के लिए अगर फोर्थ क्रेनियल नर्व जो है वो डैमेज हो गया है कंप्लीटली, तो हम पता कर सकते हैं पेशेंट को पूछ के. अगर पेशेंट बोल रहा है कि शोल्डर रीजन में उसको सेंसरी इनपुट नहीं हो रहा है, अगर हम उसे टैप कर रहे हैं या हम पिंच कर रहे हैं तो पेशेंट को पेन फील नहीं हो रहा है, तो वी कैन अंडरस्टैंड दैट द डर्मेटोम ऑफ द शोल्डर रीजन हैज बीन अफेक्टेड एंड द डर्मेटोम ऑफ द शोल्डर रीजन इज सप्लाइड बाय द C4 क्रेनियल नर्व. तो हमें इससे ये समझ में आएगा कि जो फोर्थ क्रेनियल नर्व है उसमें इंजरी हुई है मेनली. और डर्मेटोम्स में यूजुअली मल्टीपल नर्व्स का सप्लाई रहता है. समटाइम्स अदर नर्व्स आल्सो सप्लाई टू अ सिंगल डर्मेटोम. तो अगर हम एक पर्टिकुलर रीजन को स्टिमुलेट करते हैं पर वो सेंसेशन कंप्लीटली परसीव नहीं हो रही है, तो हम समझ सकते हैं कि जो मल्टीपल बंडल्स एक साइड प्रेजेंट है, जैसे अगर ये रीजन में हम लोग उसको स्टिमुलेट कर रहे हैं पेशेंट को पर उसको कोई भी फीलिंग नहीं आ रही है, तो हम समझ सकते हैं कि T1 T2 T3 तीनों नर्व्स में डैमेज हुआ हो सकता है. बट अगर पार्शियली पेशेंट को फील हो रहा है तो एक पर्टिकुलर नर्व हमको पता चल सकता है, जैसे कि ये रीजन में और ये रीजन में पेशेंट को फील हो रहा है बट बीच में नहीं हो रहा, तो वी कैन अंडरस्टैंड दैट द T2 और द सेकंड thoracic spinal nerve has been damaged. And इसीलिए dermatomes are important especially to diagnose conditions and to know which part of the spinal cord has been damaged. Now, as we learned about the plexuses, these are the networks that are formed from different spinal nerves. So the first is the cervical plexus. It is formed by the roots or the anterior rami of the first four cervical nerves, which is C1 to C4, and there are contributions from C5. The cervical plexus supplies the skin and muscles of the head, neck, and superior part of the shoulders and chest. And there is a nerve known as the phrenic nerve, which arises from the cervical plexus and it supplies the motor fibers to the diaphragm. So diaphragm is a muscle which lies under the lungs, and it is especially important for inhalation and exhalation. So there is a nerve known as the phrenic nerve that arises from this cervical plexus or the cervical network that is formed uh, from the combination of C1 to C4 nerves. And the phrenic nerve supplies the diaphragm. These are the nerves of the cervical plexus: lesser occipital, transverse cervicular, supraclavicular, and this is the distribution. So skin and muscles of the head, neck, and superior part of shoulders and chest. And here it has been explained in detail. जैसे skin of scalp, posterior and superior to ear, and then parotid glands, skin over the lateral aspect of neck, and skin over superior portion of chest and shoulder. And these are deep branches. The superficial branches are sensory, and the deep ones are the motor branches. And these supply the infrahyoid, geniohyoid muscles of neck, infrahyoid muscles of neck, the C2 to C3, C3 to C5, which involves the phrenic nerve, supplies the diaphragm, and then C1 to C5 overall supplies the deep muscles of neck, levator scapulae, and middle scalene muscles. Now, what happens if an injury occurs to the phrenic nerve? It is one of the most important nerve present in the cervical plexus. The phrenic nerves originate from C3, C4, and C5. C3 to C5, and it supplies the diaphragm, which is a very major muscle contributing in the inhalation and exhalation. Complete severing of the spinal cord above the origin of the phrenic nerves causes respiratory arrest. So अगर फेनिक नर्व को इंजरी हो रही है तो उसकी वजह से डायफ्राम जो है वो ढंग से काम नहीं कर पाएगा, तो उसकी वजह से इनहेलेशन एंड एक्सहेलेशन में प्रॉब्लम होगी पेशेंट को एंड रेस्पिरेटरी अरेस्ट हो सकता है. In injuries to the phrenic nerves, breathing stops because the phrenic nerves no longer send nerve impulses to the diaphragm. तो अगर डायफ्राम जो है वो रिलैक्स या कॉन्ट्रैक्ट ना नहीं करेगा तो it is impossible or difficult for the patient to inhale or exhale, and that's why the breathing stops in cases of injuries to the phrenic nerve. This is an image of the cervical plexus. It is a network of various spinal nerves from C1 to C5. And these are the various nerves that are present in the cervical plexus. The hypoglossal, this is a cranial nerve. These are the spinal nerves: the lesser occipital, great auricular, transverse cervical, superior root of ansa cervicalis, and inferior root of ansa cervicalis. And this is the supraclavicular nerve. And this is the phrenic nerve, which supplies the diaphragm. The second plexus that is seen is the brachial plexus. And the roots of spinal nerves from C5 to C8 and T1 form the brachial plexus. C5 to C8 and T1 forms the brachial plexus, which extends inferiorly and laterally on either side of the last four cervical and first thoracic vertebrae. These are the last four cervical and the first thoracic vertebrae. It passes above the first rib posterior to the clavicle and then enters the axilla. Brachial plexus provides almost the entire nerve supply of the shoulder and upper limbs. The cervical plexus supplies to the skin of scalp and skin of the face, etc. But the brachial plexus supplies mainly to the shoulders and upper limbs. There are five large terminal branches that arise from the brachial plexus. The first is the axillary nerve that supplies the deltoid and teres minor muscles. There is a musculocutaneous nerve that supplies the anterior muscles of the arm. A radial nerve that supplies the muscles on the posterior aspect of the arm and forearm. A median nerve that supplies most of the muscles of the anterior forearm and some of the muscles of the hand. And an ulnar nerve that supplies the anteromedial muscles of the forearm and most of the muscles of hand. So these are the five large terminal branches that arises from the brachial plexus: the axillary nerve, musculocutaneous nerve, radial nerve, median nerve, and ulnar nerve. And it mainly supplies to the deltoid and teres minor muscles, anterior muscles of arm, posterior of the arm and forearm, then anterior forearm and some muscles of hand, and the ulnar nerve supplies the anteromedial muscles of the forearm and most of the muscles of the hand. This is the image of the brachial plexus. It starts from C5 to C8, the last four cervical nerves and the first thoracic nerve. These are the roots, these are the trunk, cords, and then these are the branches. The nerves involved are suprascapular, then musculocutaneous, median nerve, radial, ulnar, that we have seen earlier. This is the image of injuries or the disorders that occurs due to injuries to brachial plexus. The first is a Duchenne palsy or the waiter's step, where the patient's wrist drops, and this is also a wrist drop which occurs due to the injury to a brachial plexus. The waiter's step position is occurred due to the injury to the brachial plexus, where the arm is medially rotated and the elbow is extended. The forearm is pronated and the wrist is flexed. That condition is known as the waiter's step position, and there is a loss of sensation along the lateral side of the arm. Injury to the radial nerve, that is this is the radial nerve of the brachial plexus, and if an injury occurs to the radial nerve, it can cause a wrist drop. This is caused due to the radial nerve injury, and it is the inability to extend the wrist and fingers. So we cannot extend the wrist or the fingers. This is known as a wrist drop. Then injury to the median nerve leads to median nerve palsy, which is indicated by numbness, tingling, and pain in the palm and the fingers. Then we have ulnar nerve palsy, which occurs to the injury in the ulnar nerve, and it is the inability to abduct or adduct the fingers, and there is atrophy of the interosseous muscles, which leads to hyperextension of the metacarpophalangeal joints and flexion of the interphalangeal joints, and there is a loss of sensation over the little finger. Then injury to the long thoracic nerve results in paralysis of the serratus anterior muscle, and the medial border of the scapula protrudes. So when the injury to the long thoracic nerve is caused, it leads to a winging of the right scapula, as we can see here. These are the injuries, these are the disorders or abnormalities that is caused due to injuries of brachial plexus. The first is a waiter's step. The second is a wrist drop caused due to injury to the radial nerve. Third is a median nerve palsy caused due to injury of the median nerve. There is numbness and tingling and loss of sensation. Then ulnar nerve palsy caused due to injury of the ulnar nerve, and the winging of right scapula caused due to injury of long thoracic nerve. The third is a lumbar plexus. So this plexus consists of roots of spinal nerves from L1 to L4 from the lumbar plexus. The nerves are mentioned here. It is iliohypogastric, ilioinguinal. The origin is from L1 and it supplies to the muscles of anterolateral abdominal wall, skin of inferior abdomen and buttock. And the ilioinguinal nerve supplies to the muscles of the anterolateral abdominal wall, similar to the iliohypogastric, and to the skin of superior and medial aspect of thigh, root of penis and scrotum in male, and the labia majora and mons pubis in the female. So this applies to the anterolateral abdominal wall and some parts of thigh and the genital areas in both males and females. There is genitofemoral nerve which originates from L1 to L2 and supplies the cremaster muscle. Skin over middle anterior surface of thigh, scrotum in male, and labia majora in female. Then we have lateral cutaneous nerve of thigh originated from L2 to L3. It supplies to the skin over lateral, anterior, and posterior aspects of thigh. The next is the femoral nerve originated from L2 to L4. It is the largest nerve arising from lumbar plexus, distributed to flexor muscles of hip joint and extensor muscles of knee joint, skin over anterior and medial aspect of thigh and medial side of leg and foot. The last is the obturator nerve, originated from L2 to L4, supplies to the adductor muscles of hip joint and skin over medial aspect of thigh. Uh, What happens if injuries occur to the lumbar plexus? The largest nerve arising from the lumbar plexus is the femoral nerve, as we had seen in the previous table. Injuries to the femoral nerve, which can occur in stab or gunshot wounds, are indicated by an inability to extend the leg and by loss of sensation in the skin over the anteromedial aspect of the thigh. So if the injury to the femoral nerve occurs, which might be due to stab or a gunshot wound or any other injury or trauma caused in that region, the patient has an inability to extend the leg and there is a loss of sensation seen in the skin over the anteromedial aspect of the thigh. The second nerve is the obturator nerve, and if injuries occur to this nerve, it results in paralysis of the adductor muscles of the thigh and the loss of sensation over the medial aspect of the thigh. And this injury might result from pressure on the nerve by fetal head during pregnancy. This is the lumbar plexus, and as we can see, it supplies mainly to the low abdominal region. The last is the sacral and coccygeal plexus. The roots of spinal nerves L4, L5, and S1 and S4 form the sacral plexus. This plexus supplies the buttocks, perineum, and lower limbs. And the largest nerve in the body, which is the sciatic nerve, is present in the sacral plexus. The roots of spinal nerves S4, S5, and the coccygeal nerves form a small coccygeal plexus. This is a small network which involves the S4 and S5 nerve and the one pair of coccygeal nerve. Now, what happens if injury occurs to the sciatic nerve, which is the largest nerve of the body? Injury to the sciatic nerve results in sciatica pain that may extend from the buttock down the posterior and lateral aspect of the leg and the lateral aspect of the foot. So injury to the sciatic nerve results in a condition known as sciatica pain, and this pain extends from the buttock down to the posterior and lateral aspect of the leg, and it might also travel till the foot. The sciatic nerve may be injured because of a slipped or herniated disc, a dislocated hip, osteoarthritis of the lumbosacral spine. Osteoarthritis is the gradual degeneration and pain of joints, pathological shortening of the lateral rotator muscles of the thigh, pressure from the uterus during pregnancy. The fetus might apply a pressure from the uterus during pregnancy in females, and that might either damage or block the sciatica nerve, which leads to pain. Other factors are inflammation, irritation, or an improperly administered gluteal intramuscular injection. So if there is an improper administration of IM injection in the gluteal region, it might also lead to injury of sciatica nerve. This was the sacral and coccygeal plexus, and this was all about the anatomy and structure of spinal cord. So that's it for today's session. Let's summarize the points that we learned today. Firstly, what is the spinal cord? It is the part of the central nervous system that extends from the brain. This is the external view of the spinal cord. There are certain protective structures that protect the spinal cord. The first is the vertebral column. These are the bony structures or a stack of vertebrae that protect the spinal cord from shock. There are meninges, which mainly has three coverings known as the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. And there are denticulate ligaments that also protect the spinal cord against sudden displacement that is a result of shock. We learned in detail about the meninges, the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. From superficial to the inner covering, dura is the outermost, arachnoid is the middle, and pia is the innermost covering. Then we learned the external anatomy of the spinal cord. It is an oval flattened structure, and it starts from the medulla oblongata to the superior L2 vertebrae, and it is approximately 42 to 45 centimeters in adults. Then there are enlargements. The first is the cervical enlargement, and the second is the lumbar enlargement, also known as superior and inferior enlargement, respectively. The superior enlargement consists of nerves of the upper limb, and the inferior consists of nerves of the lower limb. This is the detail of the cervical enlargement and lumbar enlargement. And this is an image. This is the cervical enlargement, and this is the lumbar enlargement. And this is the conus medullaris, a cone-like tapering of the spinal cord. And then we have the filum terminale, which is a terminal filament or filament-like structure at the end of the spinal cord. Then we learned in detail about the internal anatomy, which mainly consists of the white matter and gray matter. The gray matter is shaped as a butterfly or a H shape and is in the inner part of the spinal cord. The white matter is at the outer part. There are subdivided regions of the gray matter known as horn, which has three types: posterior gray horn, lateral gray horn, and anterior gray horn. And because of the gray matter, the white matter is also divided into regions known as the posterior white column, lateral white column, and the anterior white column. Then we learned about the process of sensory motor output. So there are multiple steps. The first is the sensory impulse is sensory input is received from the sensory receptors. The impulse travels and it reaches the white matter and is ascended to the brain. The second is the sensory input is received through the receptors and it enters the gray matter, forms a synapse with the interneuron, and then it again ascends to the brain. The third is the sensory impulse travels to the anterior gray matter and forms a synapse with the interneurons and either gives an output to the skeletal muscle or it gives an output to the autonomic motor neuron, which further controls the cardiac muscles, smooth muscles, and the glands. These are various segments and the distinguishing characteristics. The cervical segment has a relatively large diameter. The thoracic is small in diameter, but the white matter is in a higher amount. The lumbar is nearly circular, and the sacral has a higher amount of gray matter, and the coccygeal resembles lower sacral spinal segments and is very much smaller. We learned about the spinal nerves. They connect the central nervous system to sensory receptors, muscles, and glands. And the first cervical pair exists between the occipital bone and atlas, and there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Then we learned about the connective tissue coverings of these spinal nerves. There are three coverings: the endoneurium, perineurium, and epineurium. Endoneurium covers a single axon. The perineurium covers the bundle of axon, also known as fascicles, and the epineurium is the outermost covering, which covers the whole spinal nerve. We learned about the distribution of spinal nerves. It is done by branches, plexuses, and intercostal nerves. Branches are the divisions of a single spinal nerve. Plexuses are a network of nerves, and intercostal nerves are the thoracic nerves T2 to T12 that directly supply to the different organs or intercostal spaces. We learned about dermatomes. Dermatomes are the segments of skin that is directly supplied by either the trigeminal nerve or the spinal nerve, and each of the segment is termed as a dermatome, and it is important to identify an injury to the spinal cord. We learned in detail about the plexus. The first is the cervical plexus, which is formed by the anterior rami of C1 to C4 spinal nerves, and it supplies to the skin and muscles of the head, neck, and superior part of shoulders and chest. And there is an important nerve known as the phrenic nerve that supplies the diaphragm. We learned about injuries to the phrenic nerve. This results in respiratory arrest and the breathing stops in the patient. We learned about brachial plexus. This is formed by the roots or anterior rami of spinal nerve C5 to C8 and T1. And there are five large terminal branches: the axillary nerve, musculocutaneous nerve, radial nerve, median nerve, and ulnar nerve. And we learned about injuries to the abnormalities that occurs due to injuries caused in the brachial plexus. We have Vater's tip, wrist drop, median nerve palsy, ulnar nerve palsy, and winging of the right scapula. We learned about the lumbar plexus, which is formed by the roots of spinal nerves L1 to L4 from the lumbar plexus. And these are the various nerves present along with its distribution. We learned about the abnormalities caused due to injuries to the lumbar plexus, which involves injury to the femoral nerve or injury to the obturator nerve that results in loss of sensation and paralysis, respectively. Then the final plexus is the sacral and coccygeal plexuses, which involves the roots of spinal nerves L4, L5, and S1 to S4. And the coccygeal plexus involves S4 and S5 nerve along with the one pair of coccygeal nerve. And the largest nerve of the body, also known as the sciatic nerve, is present in the sacral plexus. And injury to this nerve causes sciatic pain that extends to the buttock, down to the leg, and it extends till the foot. And there are various causes that are mentioned. So this is what we learned today. Thanks for watching, and please share this video. Thank you.